Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here physically. I'm sure we'll use that word a few more times, physically being here. Over the next 20 to 30 minutes, basically I'll talk about what are the performance drivers that are expected of the supply chain practitioners, what are the challenges, with the current approaches that we typically see right now, and then finally, look at sort of the modern approaches in terms of how we can go about it. So I'm going to go into a bit more nuts and bolts rather than showing you a lot of pretty graphs and stuff, right? Because a lot of them have been available for quite a while, but it's the nuts and bolts that kind of need to be changed. Okay. Yeah. So as I said, I'll talk about 5 C's as the performance drivers. 5 L's as the typical challenges, and then cloud as a foundational technology to sort of move forward. So let's kind of look at how the supply chains have been evolving. This is a chart based on the research that we did with the Swiss University, University of St. Gallen. So again, it kind of talks about where the supply chains were traditionally very cost-driven, sort of cost being a fundamental driver. If you look at the CEOs, right, a couple of years back, they would say, how much inventory can you reduce, right? That was a very familiar conversation. But as sort of we are moving forward, there is a lot more dependency on the supply chains to drive meaningful customer experience, to drive compliance. Obviously, cost is always a factor. More and more CSR or carbon footprint, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, that's another driver. And with all the shortages that we are seeing, whether it's the people on the shop floor or driver shortage and so on, so the human capital is a key part of what the supply chain practitioners need to drive as well. So basically, kind of the way I think of this is that the modern supply chain leaders need to drive so-called 5 C's as the performance drivers. So 1 C is not enough anymore. And again, there was a letter from Larry Fink to the CEOs of a lot of large firms, which again talked about how CSR or sustainability needs to be a key driver of the stakeholder value. So let's look at some of the work that we see that's being done and the successful projects. So again, what we see is there's a very, very clear focus on one or multiple of those C's. So if I pick a couple of examples here, a bit hard to read. The one on the sort of middle right is from Unilever, where they are trying to drive cost, carbon footprint, and customer experience from the logistics operation. So basically, what they want to do is make sure the number of trucks that are being driven, number of miles being driven by the trucks are reduced, while the cost remains under control, as well as they can double their business as well. So that sort of operation really helped them during the pandemic, because certain ports were closed. The certain operators were not there, so kind of by having a single logistics operation, they could meet on those 3 C's. If I look at the example at the middle, middle top in blue, this is from a distributor in the UK. So this was driven by the CFO, and the focus was really around customer experience. So the idea was, let's just not spend too much money on making the front end nice and pretty. Let's really make sure that from a supply chain perspective, we can actually have the right availability of stock, and we can deliver to the customers in a meaningful way. Then the example at the top right in sort of reddish is from a food manufacturer in the US, where along with the cost, the key driver was reducing the food wastage, or CSR basically as a key driver. So again, there are a lot of examples from multiple sectors, but I guess the key point is the success is coming where there's a very, very clear sponsorship and a very clear focus on one or multiple of those Cs. So for a meaningful change, right, there are a lot of sort of building blocks, if you will, right from the operating model that needs to change to the way you define business processes and so on. For the sake of today's chat, we'll just focus on technology and how we can move forward. So before we kind of look at where to go, let's look at how we have come to where we are right now. So if you look at the evolution of systems, right, a couple of decades back, the objective was the same: single source of truth. All the ERPs, there was everything was in one particular place. But as basically the world got complex, the supply chains became global. A lot of new software categories came about, whether it's the APS category or logistics or PLM solutions or procurement solutions and so on. So basically, there was almost as much data outside the ERP as you had within the ERP. And even if you had one ERP, there were multiple instances of that ERP. So that sort of picture is basically giving you a couple of challenges. Challenges in terms of how can you assemble the data, right? So nowadays, you don't just have the IT data, information technology, you also have a lot of operational technologies, whether it's the sensor data coming from the trucks or the data coming from the machines. So again, with that sort of mishmash of various applications, it's quite hard to have a packaged data in a meaningful way. The next issue was around the lag in terms of analytics. So typically, those applications were really good at number crunching, but not really good at giving you the meaningful information. So normally, you would take the data out, throw that into a data warehouse, and you will report from there. But there was a lag in terms of whether it's a one-day lag, couple of hours lag, or whatever. So that was sort of a real issue in terms of trying to use the data. And the third sort of issue that we see is in terms of applying artificial intelligence. So because of this mishmash, a lot of the approaches where AI is being applied is more on the reporting layer, really. So you extract all the data, and you're trying to apply AI on that, rather than AI being a key part of your business process, whether it's a procurement process or a S&OP process or so on. So what is that causing, right? So those issues in terms of not being able to assemble data smoothly, not being able to apply AI properly, or not being able to have the data analytics at the same time. So the challenge that we typically see is so-called 5 Ls, latency, occurring at different stages. How quickly can you sense something that is happening in the world that might have an impact on your supply chain? Obviously, Suez Canal comes to mind, but now there are so many other factors, right? Even the fuel shortage and so on. So how quickly can you predict that? Once it's there, how quickly can your organization detect that? How quickly then it can be filtered to the right people within your organization? Because that's the key as well, right? How is your operating model set up? And once it does reach to the right people, how quickly can you look at various scenarios and decide what is the course of action, right? That's kind of another level. And the final one, really most important, is once you have decided a certain course of action, can you actually execute on that, right? That's the key as well. So that's kind of where we see the latency in terms of finding something, making sure it reaches the right people, having the scenarios done, and finally implementing that decision that is being taken there. So in terms of, sort of way forward, what we see is sort of three core principles. First is around the data assembly, right? So what you really want is a neat way where the data is automatically assembled, where you don't have the data quality issues. So there what we're seeing is cloud or SaaS as the foundation, so that everything is always connected across the business process, everything is always up to date. You can bring in the latest data, you can bring in the latest innovation and so on. So that's kind of one thing that we're seeing in terms of those deployments that I talked about, cloud being a foundational technology to assemble the data. The second one then in terms of applying AI is that AI is embedded within each business process. So it's not an afterthought, right? Like a car, right? If you look at Tesla, kind of AI is part of that, both in terms of how much can you automate a business process, whether it's a procurement process or sales and operations planning process or any logistics business process, but also how it can give you intelligence, right? So if it is logistics operation, how can you have a more predictive ETA, using AI based on the port closures and so on. And the third one is in terms of the analytics lag. So rather than having to push data into a data warehouse and waiting for some time, basically having that reporting operational at that business process level. So it's not a separate process, but as you're running your processes, whether it's again procurement process or order fulfillment process, is kind of there, then and there basically. So in terms of sort of what you should expect and what is available in the marketplace right now, you should expect to have, some sort of a supply chain cloud platform. So think of it like your phone and the marketplace, right? The applications marketplace, where everything is always connected, it automatically gets updated, it automatically incorporates new technologies and so on. So that's kind of vision that you need to think of. Obviously, it's going to take a while to implement on that vision, but in terms of adopting technology, that's kind of the mindset, applications marketplace, think of that supply chain cloud marketplace as that place to get to. So it should be able to detect a lot of signals, should be able to incorporate both digital signals as well as able to read and incorporate data from various sensors, various machine devices, and so on. So that should be quite a standard packaged process. It should be able to, as I said, provide data and the analytics on the fly rather than you having to wait for sending data to a data warehouse. And then it should be automatically connected to the delivery processes, whatever those processes are, so that you can execute on that. That's kind of, how you need to think of in terms of where to get to. Yeah, if I just build that up, so you will see quite a busy chart there. But the key is, rather than thinking of supply chain as 5 or 6 different functional areas, so what we are seeing is more and more people thinking of supply chains end to end, right? There is no point in having a great sales and operations planning process if you can't have a good deal with the suppliers, or if they can't commit to the right level of supply. Again, no good having a good order fulfillment process if you don't have the right arrangements with the 3PLs to ship them around. So that's kind of the key trend that we're seeing is, let's not think of supply chain as 6 different business processes, but it needs to be think through end to end. Okay, so let's just look at a couple of sort of charts, just to bring it to life a little bit in terms of what's available right now. This is more like an exec kind of a dashboard where you can see, again, not just the OTIF number, but a lot more, what's the revenue from different products, what's the market sentiment, and so on. This one is around logistics, where, as you can see, there are there are signs of trees and stuff. So again, there is a lot of packaging that has been done to understand the greenhouse gas emissions. Again, each country has different standards. China has different standards. US has different standards. Again, a lot of that has been packaged to understand what's the what's the carbon footprint of your logistics operation, along with the other standard parameters. Another one is around resiliency. So again, it's a control tower which is pre-packaged, where you're looking at what's the impact of weather, what's the impact of different news, and so on. Again, we have talked about it for ages, but the issue is how do you package that, right? That's kind of the key difference. So again, in terms of packaging, this charts tries to bring to life how a lot of the data has been packaged to give this kind of a dashboard. So it's not about you having to, kind of manually pull data from hundreds of sources. That pre-packaging nowadays, you should expect it automatically. Yeah, this one is around procurement area. You can see what are the kind of, factors, financial, social, environmental, and which suppliers are impacted, the number of suppliers, and so on. Another one around the port congestion. So the key here again is, you can detect the event, right? But what does it mean? So again, a lot of packaging has been done to contextualize that event. What does that event mean to my supply chain? So that's kind of where a lot of the AI or ML has been applied, so that you can kind of, what does that event mean? Which orders will be shorted? Which orders will be delayed? That's kind of where, where the packaging you should expect nowadays from technology. Yeah, as I say, what's the root analysis, purchasing impact, and so on. Simulate, what's the next course of action, but then most importantly, execute on those actions. So that's kind of, what you should expect nowadays. It's not just about seeing those events, it's about contextualizing those events, looking at different scenarios, and then implementing a course of action. So that's kind of what you should expect from modern technology. So again, while it's great to have that available, right, but you can't implement overnight. So kind of the approaches that we see are really fourfold, based on thousands of deployments. A lot of people on the top left is basically will take a business process and start with that. It could be a procurement process, it could be sales and operations planning or logistics. But basically, take one business process and try to get that to the cloud. The second approach that we see is what we call divisional transformation, and on the bottom right in light green, where it could be a new business which is growing quite quickly and has no legacy in terms of systems and so on, or it could be a division which is moving quite fast. So there, basically, you're deploying end-to-end a new, the new approach that I talked about. And the final one at the top right is complete transformation, where there is just so much change happening within that business that they're going for a big bang. So there are examples like FedEx that is going with that big bang approach, or Western Digital. So again, we see examples in each of those cases, but that's kind of how people are going about it. Yeah, here are a couple of examples. Okay, and yeah, to summarize, really, I think successful initiatives, basically, there's a very, very clear from the top on those 5 C's. Why are we doing it? And that strong point of view is absolutely critical because the journey will be tough, right? It's not going to be a success overnight as long as everyone knows where you're going towards, then you will be aligned. And then from a technology perspective, we are seeing cloud first as a key foundational technology so that you can have a platform that is not just fit for today, but fit for the future as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Now, we are going to run through some questions as well. I have received some questions through the app. But with this session and all sessions that we have today, if anyone has any questions from the floor, then please just do raise a hand, and we'll come to you with a microphone. But for now, I think we're going to have the questions up on here, yeah. So the top question there, so that was actually asked by Glenn White. How can technology enable differential business outcomes?
I think the key really is the speed at which you can use technology to drive decisions, right? That's basically the key. And the scope of that decision making. The more you can have a wider scope. So what I mean by that is not just looking at procurement standalone, not just looking at logistics standalone, but looking at the broader supply chain or even finance because of the new business models that are coming up. Supply chain needs to understand, what is the implication for finance from a margin perspective. So I guess the broader the scope of the functional areas that you can look at and the speed at which you can drive those decisions is a key driver.
Okay. Let's take the second one here. How important is the data strategy to supply chain transformation, and how are the analytics managed?
So I would say, like I was talking, the key difference is the number of C's that you need to drive today. If it was just cost, people know how to drive that. If it was just customer experience and you could have infinite inventory, right, it's no-brainer as well, right? But I think the key thing nowadays is the supply chain leaders are being asked more and more to drive those 5 C's. And the more you have to drive those 5 C's, the more data becomes a key lever to balance out those levers because it's not one versus another. You have to drive all the 5 C's. And the more you think of that, the more I think data becomes critical to drive that.
Okay. There was a question I was just about to ask then. It disappeared. I do have one here, actually. When it comes to sustainability, because everyone's talking about sustainability right now, and you mentioned there the end-to-end supply chain, or looking at your supply chain as an end-to-end solution. So is that essential to have that end-to-end visibility when you are thinking about sustainability?
Yes. I would say kind of where we see right now is still a lot of functional queries where a sustainability conversation is coming from a logistics function or a procurement function. But I think what we are seeing is as the CFOs are being asked more and more to drive their sustainability as well, I think supply chains are being pushed to look end to end basically, not just from a visibility perspective, but from a whole carbon footprint and even the wider factors, right? Health and well-being and water usage and so on. So not just pure carbon footprint, but the broader CSR agenda, if you will.
Okay. Another question at the bottom there. I mean, yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, tell us what the 5 C's stands for, and especially about the climate element there.
Yeah, so 5 C's as said. So cost, which supply chains guys and girls have been used to for years and years. Customer experience, I think people are typically looked at as OTIF, which not many CFOs and CEOs probably understand, or customer service, but I would say, we need to up the game and talk about customer experience, because you are key, right? Unless supply chain delivers, it's not a meaningful customer experience, right? If I order from Tesco, half the stuff is not there, right? It's not a great customer experience, right? So customer experience, compliance, regulatory compliance is absolutely critical. Again, I think we see tariffs being placed across the countries, obviously closer to home. Brexit is a key factor. So I think more and more, you have to be up to date in terms of which country is imposing what tariffs so that you're on the right side of the law. So I think that compliance is key. CSR, carbon footprint, or broader CSR, as I said, right, that's absolutely critical. We are seeing right now. And human capital, right, both in terms of right skill set available, both at the operational level, like right now we are seeing the drivers and with the factory people on the shop floor and so forth. But also more importantly, I would say, to drive the supply chain transformation, you need a different kind of leadership as well. So not just a functional leadership, but more importantly, like a business leadership is required, as well as new skills like data and so on. So I think that human capital is absolutely key part, and the talent management is key part of supply chain practitioners.
So bearing in mind those points you just made there, do you think that supply chain leaders in the future need to change? They need to be a different kind of individual, different skill sets?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And data is the key point there?
Yeah, data would be one of the key points. I think they need to, so again, I talked about the operating model, so data is one of the key elements. Other would be understanding the customer segments. I think that's absolutely critical as well. So you need to understand, what are the customer behaviors. So think of your supply chains based on customer behaviors, right? John Gatton, I don't know if you know him, he talks quite a lot about segmenting your supply chains based on those customer behaviors. I think understanding finance and the cost got to be a key driver as well. So yeah, absolutely, I think there are, and managing talent. So yeah, there got to be different types. A couple of years back, actually, Unilever, someone from Unilever talked about how their sales guy took the supply chain leadership role. So basically, they were talking about supply chain at the heart of the business, and a very different kind of a guy who took that role and driving promotions based on what supply chain think is right, rather than marketing guy driving a promotion, and you have no stuff to supply, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was interviewing somebody a week ago, I think it was, and they were saying how procurement, and especially CPOs, how they are naturally destined to become the leading CEOs of the future, because procurement is now such an essential element of a business's success. So do you see a similar thing for supply chain as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I think depends, how procurement is set up in different organizations. In some organizations, procurement is kind of seen as a wider part of chief supply chain's remit. In other organizations, obviously CPO is a key role in itself. I think that connection with the supply chain is key from a procurement perspective, especially as the business models are changing. You need suppliers who are collaborating with you to come up with new products. It's not just, reducing the spend, right? It's more about how can you supply, how can you support the growth? Absolutely, that's quite critical.
Okay, and you talked there about suppliers. So who are the key partners and suppliers that Oracle's been working with for the analysis, the analytics?
Yeah, so basically, kind of what we have done is, right, with that marketplace approach that I talked about. So, there's a core capability that is out there, and beyond that, we are saying, we obviously won't know each and every market, each and every functional area, each and every industry area to kind of, build that capability. So then we're seeing all sorts of partners, right, from very niche partners. The two I showed around resilience control tower was Trinomics. Second one I showed around logistics was around Inspirage. But from there, as well as the likes of Deloitte, KPMG, and so they're all building the capability to extend that platform. But the key principle is it's one platform that's always connected, it's always up to date, and it's automatically incorporating new technologies so that you don't have to deploy hundreds of data scientists as a science project, basically. So that's the key difference.
Okay. Were there any questions from the floor before I go to one final one on here? No. Okay. Okay, so let's take the question at the top here. How do you digitalize tail-end suppliers in a global supply chain that still operate a paper-based or at best email-driven process?
I think end of the day, it comes to, you can't, get everyone to the same level of maturity, right? It's the impact those suppliers will have on your supply chain, right? I think that's kind of the way to look at. From a supplier, from a technology perspective, there are a lot more capabilities around onboarding and stuff like that, right? But that's typically not an issue. Issue is more cultural change and behavior. So I think it kind of depends on the criticality of those suppliers and whether you can afford that manual process, how big you are, how big they are, kind of stuff, right? So I'm not sure if there is a single approach, but I would say if they're really, really critical, then maybe you have to spend some extra resources on your side to take them through that process, if you will, rather than just pushing them to digitalize.
Yeah, I spoke with a CPO recently. I won't say his name or the organisation, but he was saying when it came to their suppliers, some of them didn't even have email capability. Yeah, well, it sounds crazy right now in this day and age, but is this something that is still common? But are people so backward when it comes to digital?
It's depending on which suppliers you're talking to. I think with the last 18 months, a lot has changed. Like nowadays, you can buy ice cream digitally, which I think 2 years back would not have been possible. So I think it has changed quite a lot. But I think the issue was never a technology really. Issue was more the sort of cultural change and how you're talking to them. That's kind of how I would say that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll leave it there. So thank you, Vikram.
Yes, all. Thank you.
I'll just take that from you. Thank you, Vikram.